Ametakipi apetukile mechanteta wogla ke hanape choose apala. Emacha Steve Tamayo. Emacha sichangula kote chile tiwahi ta asampayo yanke. Hello, my relatives. My name is Steve Tamayo. I'm the cultural specialist for the Omaha Public Schools. I work specifically with the NICE program. It's a Native Indigenous Center of Education here in Omaha, Nebraska. And I'm very happy to be in one of the conference rooms at the Jaza Museum. And so I'd like to thank Annika Johnson for allowing us to have this access to the collection and a lot of our relatives here. And so as Indigenous people, you know, we acknowledge a lot of our clothing and artifacts and all these things that exist as relatives. We acknowledge the four-legged, the winged relatives in which we were able to produce a lot of these items. And so even these hides that we've utilized, you know, that have been brain tanned. And so I'm a brain tanner, so I understand the importance and how hard it actually is to obtain this material. And so long ago, when we butchered out our buffaloes, our elk, and our deer, we would scrape off a lot of the meat, the fat, the epidermis, and the membrane. And then from our fires, we would actually saturate a lot of our hides because of the alkaline in the ash. And so that helped swell the hides up and would help release the hair. And so this, once again, is a process that we would incorporate into brain tanning. And so that look of brain tanning is something that you just can't, you know, it's very distinctive. And so when I look at these hides, you know, I can tell you that it's been brain tanned, you know, by both sides. And brain tan hides, you can actually hold it up to your mouth and blow through it. And so we say that a lot of our clothing is breathable that way. And so that's how important that is. And so it just allows our pores and the heat to escape, you know, a lot of our clothing. And so these hampas in front of me belong to our wichashas, to our men. And so I have different artifacts here, once again, of our relatives that I will be going through and explaining each one. And so these hampas are amazing. So once again, you know, for the tribes that exist, you know, the designs that we incorporate into our clothing actually explains the region that it comes from, but very specific, the bands and the tribes and the clans, you know, and it breaks down and gets very, very complicated. And so when I look at these, I knew that they were Lakota Moccasin specific because of the numerology that's incorporated. And so for us as Lakotas, we utilize very specific numbers of 4s, 7s, 13s, and 28. And so when I look at artifacts, that's what I start looking at. I start counting the elements, the design concepts that exist in our footwear, our clothing, our dresses, you know. And so in this one, it has a very specific number of 7s. And so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The 7th one is right here. And so the importance of our tipestala, our tipi, is that it extends up. And so understanding that the points that are actually grounded, our tipi poles, extends up, and it actually creates and tells the story of the Wichakpe, the Star Nation people. And so each one of our tips of our poles represents very specific stars in our constellations and our stories of star knowledge. And so in this, we follow that same ideology of our existence. And so when you look at our hampas on the top of them, you can see this hourglass design. Here's one teepee and then how it extends up. And so this is a true concept of Lakota moccasins. And so once again, you know, I know that these are male moccasins because of the tongue and how it's forked. And so this is common trait, once again, for our wichashas, our men, our males, to actually have moccasins, or the tongues look like that, to identify gender specific once again. And so for Indigenous people, you know, we had a lot of respect for our, what we call Winkte, our Blokanwi, and these are the people who live that other lifestyle. And so there is another grouping of people that are very specific and special and sacred to us. They are the ones that conduct what we call the Wichone. These are all of our ceremonies. And so we've always had, you know, gay and lesbian people in our villages. But every now and then we would have the marked ones that we call them. They are the Wokpe Techa. Wokpe Techa are the people who actually are the two-spirited people who conduct our ceremonies. And so they are the ones that run our rituals, our ceremonies for namings and piercings and all kinds of other ceremonies. And so, but they're also the ones that understand the markings that exist. And so the markings that we tattoo or we paint on ourselves identify the status of the people. And so that's how important that is. But they're also the ones that pierce the ears. And so they have to have this specific know-how into piercing our ears, and then what do we put inside of our ear. And so once again, this brings up different bands, different societies and guilds, and also the clans that exist. So our markings, our ear piercings, our namings, these are all responsibilities of the true two-spirited people amongst our nation in the Lakotas. And so once again, back to our hompas here, quite often we'll have a little square. That square actually represents a container. Today they're known as parflesh. Back in the day, they had specific purposes. And so we have what they call woyite ojuha. And this is an envelope, and it's a long piece of rawhide that folds inward. And so on the sides, they actually have like wings that we call them. And so they come in, and then the tops would fold over. And so today we acknowledge that as a envelope parflesh container. Back in the day, you know, when we butchered our meat, all of that talo is just meat. And so when we butchered that meat, we would call that wososo. Wososo is to cut that meat paper thin. And so we would try to cut it as thin as possible and then put it on our drying racks and let the sun and the heat extract all of the moisture. And so we're making natural jerky. And so once that jerky was nice and hard and dried out, then we would fill our woyute ojuha. So the woyute is actually our food. It's the talo. It's the meat. And so they became meat containers. And so when the meat containers were full, remember, we're identifying that parflesh container as one square. But if it's full, it has 3 squares. And that's how important that is. And so that's explaining to the village. The women are telling a story of their partner and how successful of a hunter he is, because all of her containers are full all the time. And so he's able to provide that meat, but she's also kind of bragging about herself being able to fill up all of these containers. And so however many containers she puts on there tells a story of how industrious she actually is. And so there are many stories that coincide with our clothing. It's more than just adornment. It's our written language. And so once again, we understand this basic number of 7 and how we incorporate it in the Ochite Shakui, which are the 7 bands of the Lakotas. But often when we pray, you know, this is what we call the Wocheki. Wocheki, Tate Topa. And so we're acknowledging the 4 directions. As Lakotas, we start with the west, and then we go around. And we acknowledge the north, and then the east, and then the south. And this is how, in the order in which we pray. But we also pray for all of our relatives and the Wichakpe Oyate up in the stars, up in the skies. And we also pray for all of our relatives in the underworld. And so the last prayer and the last number that we identify is our own chante, is our own heart. And so we're not praying for ourselves, we're identifying ourselves as one of those sacred beings that has been placed here. And so, you know, for us as indigenous people, we all have what we call a sichun. A sichun is a gift. And so what is your gift? Some are singers, some are ceremonial people, and those are both genders once again. And so we needed the people to understand the ceremonies, but we also needed the people to understand the medicines that exist. And then how do you carry out this healing process? And so our Wakan Chasha, our Wakan, our medicine women and medicine men wasn't just one person. It was many people within that village that had this know-how to help the people survive. And so once again, looking at these hampas, you know, there's a lot of symbology here because of the 7 tipastalas, our rawhide containers, and then we also incorporate a very specific color, a very special color of this white. And this white is the innocent, it's the purity that exists. And so as little ones, we all start out this way. And so depending on how we live our life, you know, that color can change. And so that's how important that is. But that's universal. When I say universal, I mean it's worldwide. This concept of understanding the innocence and the purity. And this is why this white is so important. But then you look at the hoof print. And so this hoof print is of the buffalo. And you see that? It's the hooves that come in. And so for us, ta is the buffalo. The size of the buffalo, we acknowledge it as tonka. So ta tonka is how we identify the buffalo, but it has to be an adult male. That's ta tonka. Umahas, they say te. And so our language is very similar. That we say ta, they say te. But it's still the importance of surviving from the buffalo. And so what's so special about these hooves is when the buffalo would run in the thousands, they would actually aerate the ground because of the hoofs. And so they're not flat-footed like the cow. And so the cow was brought here from Europe. And so that's the difference there, because the buffalo would aerate the ground, and it was a continuous cycle of this prairie grass coming back. And so, you know, quite often we would actually set the prairie ablaze because we knew the importance of bringing that new life back and getting rid of all the dead plants that would exist on the surface. And so this was a common practice for all indigenous people on a place that we call Kiamakoche. They call it North America, right? So we have always identified this place as Turtle Island, all indigenous people. And so once again, you know, when you look at these moccasins, once again, the forked tongue acknowledges that it belongs to a male, a man. The 7 directions on here, the 7 tipastalas, identify and tell many stories within that itself, as well as our relative that we needed to survive with and had much respect for. And so long ago, you know, a lot of people don't talk about this, about how many millions of buffalo used to exist. And so indigenous people, we created this understanding, this relationship long ago, that we would always take care of each other. And there's a story that we call the Great Race. And so the Great Race is about who's going to control the earth. And so we came to this understanding of having mutual respect for all that exists. And so once again, understanding the importance of tatanka and how we utilize the hides for our clothing, for our tipastala, our lodges, you know, and even removing all of that hair and soaking it in that rawhide. Our ashes to make rawhide. We needed the rawhide for all of our rawhide containers and our drums and our shields and all kinds of stuff like that. And so that's how important that was. You know, we didn't have thread long ago, so the buffalo's tendons, the real sinew, is what we utilize for our thread. And so it's all about an understanding of mutual respect once again. And so the buffaloes were in the millions, just like the indigenous people. And by 1900, we almost both disappeared. And so in the 1890 census, there was less than 250,000 indigenous people on Turtle Island. Less than 250,000. And so remember, there was tens of millions of people that resided here before pre-contact. And so that's how important to understand that. As the same with numbers existed with our relative, the buffalo. And so they almost disappeared. And so there was a national park called Yellowstone that actually saved the buffalo. And so today there's only like 5,000 plus buffalo alive. You hear about the American bison, but that's genetically incorporating the buffalo and the cattle blood, the DNA. And so this is the American bison today that you hear about. And so there we have about 5 million or so. And so, but the true buffalo are, you know, not that many exist anymore, unfortunately. So once again, it's all about respect. And so I really enjoy and like these moccasins. And here's another story. On the back part, you see this piece, and we call this a welt or a wedge, and it's sewn in between our moccasin top and the moccasin sole. And so long ago we would leave that intact and we would fringe it up, and so as the individual walked, they symbolically erased their tracks so they couldn't be followed. And so that's another story that coincides with our humpas that you don't see anymore.